What's happening, everybody? Good morning today on the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. Today is Friday. Very pumped up this Friday morning. I just got off of the nicest workout that I've had in a good while. Felt like I put together a really good workout for myself outside at the local somewhat park around the corner from my house. Trying to be as active as possible during this crazy unprecedented time. Never experienced anything like this, and I hope I never do again. I hope we never do again. I hope that this is a one-shot thing. That we don't have to experience this again. That would be great. So, with that being said, behind the mic again on the Thomas Take Sports Podcast, and I've been covering a lot of MMA topics. For those of you that love to tune into my podcast for Buffalo sports topics, I've actually been taking those to Facebook Live. I've been putting a lot of those on Facebook Live, as well as my Instagram at Ryan Thomas Take, as well as my Twitter at Ryan Thomas Take. So for those of you that really miss my Buffalo Bills takes, you can find those there. And you can also find my Buffalo Bills takes on the Crowd Assist podcast, which is a new podcast that I joined under the Trainwreck Sports umbrella with Kevin Massari, my co-host. We'll be having guests on every week. We're going to do a little bit of different things these next few weeks here, next few months. And for the future, it won't just be an audio podcast. It will be actually a visual podcast. So I'm really looking forward to that. I'm just getting the equipment ready and getting all that stuff ready for your viewing and listening pleasure. How about that? So we're going to keep things on the audio side here for now. And maybe in the near future, we can get the Thomas Take Sports Podcast on the visual side of things. So let's really dive into this. The topic today that I'm going to dive into is one that there's no doubt about it. It's always a polarizing topic. Whether people agree, disagree, obviously it's a polarizing topic. In any sport, who is the GOAT? Who is the greatest of all time? That is always a question in football, in baseball, in basketball, boxing, MMA, hockey, golf. It's always the question in any sport. Tennis, it's always the question. Who is the GOAT? And that term is thrown around so much nowadays because we are so desperate as sports fans to find the next Michael Jordan that maybe we never got to experience, or maybe we experienced the tail end of it. Find the next Joe Montana. Find the next Hank Aaron. Find the next Jack Nicklaus. Find the next, you get the point. We're always looking for that next GOAT because we might not have experienced the true GOAT. Michael Jordan, Jack Nicklaus, Muhammad Ali. We're always looking for that next GOAT for us to elevate and say, this guy's the GOAT. But in almost every case of all those names that I mentioned, whether it's Hank Aaron, whether it's Joe Montana, Jack Nicklaus, these figures, and especially Muhammad Ali, these figures are revered people within their industry. They handled things as a true professional. They handled business as a true professional. And I think, for me, the distinction of the GOAT, of the greatest of all time, is not just about the athletic accomplishments, but how you conducted yourself, how you conducted business. I remember recording a podcast with Mike Lindsley of the ML Sports Platter, and we were on my podcast for this one. It was actually an Instagram Live, where I asked Mike, he's an avid Yankees fan. I wouldn't even say he's an avid Yankees fan. I'd say he's a diehard baseball fan in general. I would give him more clout than that, not just a narrow-minded Yankees fan. He's not your average narrow-minded Yankees fan. He's very, very diverse in his knowledge of baseball. And we talked about, I asked him who his top 5 greatest Yankees were. and he rattled off his greatest Yankees. And I asked him kind of in the middle of it, I had Derek Jeter as my greatest Yankee ever. And he did as well. As he went on, he stated that Jeter was his number one, who he hadn't named yet. So I kind of knew, just by assumption of naming four of their names and not naming Jeter as his greatest Yankee yet, I said, is Jeter your greatest? Because he's my greatest. And then we mutually agreed. And did Derek Jeter hit the most home runs for the New York Yankees? No, far from it. Did Derek Jeter hit for the highest batting averages year after year after year after year, like DiMaggio and Mantle and all these guys? No, he did not. But in terms of being the greatest, it's how you remembered that athlete within adversity, whether it's on the field, diamond, whatever you want to court, whatever you want to call it, ring, or out of it. Derek Jeter always represented himself in the most business-like fashion as a professional baseball player. He's playing a game for a living, but he was a true professional at his craft and approached baseball as if it was a business, because it is a business. He showed up to the ballpark with a suit, tie, and a briefcase and went to work. I appreciate that. That is probably my greatest compliment to Derek Jeter. And this podcast is not about Derek Jeter. This podcast is about a man that many, not just UFC President Dana White, but a man that many consider to be the MMA GOAT. And my problem with that, among the many problems I have with that, among the many problems that I have stating that Jon Jones is the MMA GOAT, my biggest problem with that is that shortly after someone says Jon Jones is the MMA GOAT, they go down the rabbit hole of dissecting his accomplishments and telling the whole world what he did and how he did it. Stuff that I already know due to the hardcore fandom that I have of mixed martial arts, but the casual person does not. So throwing that out there to a casual fan who doesn't know Shogun Rua, doesn't know Quentin Rampage Jackson, doesn't know Vitor Belfort, doesn't know some of these names that Jon Jones demolished during the early portion of his UFC light heavyweight title run. They don't know these guys. They might know Jon Jones for the most recent example that dates back to the beginning of their fandom. Jon Jones fought Daniel Cormier for the first time, when Jon Jones decimated UFC 200 with a failed drug test, when Jon Jones committed a hit-and-run accident. Maybe they go as far back to when Jon Jones wrapped his Bentley around a telephone pole, driving highly intoxicated, putting human lives at risk. Now, before I dive into the reputation of Jon Jones, I want to go back a little bit to what I just said about casual fans believing that Jon Jones is the GOAT and rattling off the accomplishments that Jon Jones has had that they haven't even seen. If you're going to give a fighter, or any athlete for that matter, credit, give them credit, but know what happened within the credit. Don't just say he beat Shogun, he beat Quentin, No, he didn't just beat those guys. I'd be the first to admit he didn't just beat those guys. He destroyed those guys. Got the light heavyweight title shot off of Rashad Evans' knee injury. Was offered that fight immediately after defeating future Bellator double champ Ryan Bader. And took the opportunity, as any fighter would take that opportunity. Any fighter should, and he did take that opportunity. No problem with that. Takes that fight against Shogun, he demolishes Shogun. But the Jon Jones then in 2011 was not just a combative fighter in the octagon. The Jon Jones in 2011 was fighting a version of himself that he could not destroy. And that version of himself is who he is today. A man that I honestly question Jon Jones and his remorse. I honestly question Jon Jones and his feelings towards some of the things that he has done. In recent interviews, he's talked about how people were paid off, that he paid off a sum of money to this and that. He's saying this in public interviews. And it just comes off so ignorant, very, very dark-minded in terms of looking at a hit-and-run accident as just, oops, I slipped up, I made a mistake, my bad. Well, it's not just an oops. A hit-and-run is intentional. You hit the person with your vehicle, you realize the person was hurt, you realized you were not, and you ran. You didn't just run. You ran back to your vehicle to pick up some paraphernalia for drugs. It's very tough for me to hear people praise this man and give him the distinction as the greatest of all time when he has made such poor decisions in his life continuously. Most recently, driving out to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and popping off shots, firing firearms in the dead of night, could have hurt himself, could have hurt any people that were with him, if there were people with him. Fortunately, I believe that there was not. And I go back to the point of the Jon Jones that we were shown. The UFC showed us a version of Jon Jones that was 100% fake. This bright-eyed, bright smile, joking type guy that seemed so charismatic and so fresh and so clean and so athletic and just the next big thing. I mean, at the time you thought this guy could be the next really transcendent sports figure. And it was all fake. He never wanted to be that guy. Because if he wanted to be that guy, he would have been that guy. For the same reasons that Derek Jeter was that guy, for the same reasons that Cal Ripken Jr. was that guy, for the same reasons that Michael Jordan was that guy, for the same reasons that Jack Nicklaus and Tiger Woods were that guy, for the same reasons that Wayne Gretzky was that guy. These guys understood that their talent could put the game or their respective sport on another level, and they were not going to rob the sport of that. Most importantly, they were not going to rob themselves of that. If anybody has done more damage to their own career, I can't think of another fighter than Jon Jones. You talk about a fighter with the distinction of the GOAT who has missed portions of his career due to his actions outside of the cage. This isn't Muhammad Ali protesting to go to Vietnam War for the nobility, the highest of nobility in terms of the cause and the reasons as to why he walked down that path. This is Jon Jones being a negligent moron throughout the early half, middle half, and now later half of his career. In every single phase of his career, Jon Jones and his career is marred in controversy. I think from a perspective of it being completely disrespectful, okay, we dive into this part. And bear with me for a moment here as I dive into this. We dive into this point of Jon Jones being disrespectful to himself, to his family, to his trainers, to his training partners, to the UFC, and to the sport. And to the sport. And what I mean by that is no sport has worked harder and smarter than the UFC has to become the powerhouse promotion of mixed martial arts. And Jon Jones has hurt that. Jon Jones has damaged not only his reputation, but the reputation of the UFC and Dana White. For Dana White to come out in this most recent interview, I believe it was yesterday or the day before, with Brett Okamoto, and for Dana White to say that Jon Jones is the MMA GOAT and there is no debate, that is a massive slap in the face to every MMA fan, to himself, and to the UFC, and to the sport of MMA that he essentially put on a pedestal that nobody believed it should have been on, and surpassed his very own expectations. The last thing that I would say if I was Dana White is that Jon Jones is the GOAT. That is terrible for the UFC. It is terrible for Dana White. It is terrible for MMA. And it's a slap in the face to any fighter that achieved excellence inside that UFC octagon and represented the sport the right way. Namely, George St Pierre. Namely, Demetrius Johnson. Namely, take your pick. Anybody that achieved excellence in the octagon, won a title, defended the title, was a great ambassador for the sport, represented themselves the right way. I would even go as far back to say Hoist Gracie, Ken Shamrock, Tito Ortiz, Chuck Liddell, Randy Couture. It's a slap in the face to those guys to say that this gentleman, or lack thereof, is far and away the GOAT, and there is no debate. We cannot look at the greatest of, if we're going to say that someone is the greatest of all time, they have to check off every single box. Jon Jones only checks off one box. The only box that Jon Jones checks off is his career accomplishments. Defending the title against who he defended it against in his first run as the UFC light heavyweight champion was remarkable. There's no doubt about that. But within that phase of his career, there was controversy. Within the middle phase of his career, there was controversy where he didn't really fight much. There was so much controversy. Now, in the second half of his career, as he inches closer and closer by the day to the later portion of his career, I don't think there's any redemption for Jon Jones. Because these constant things continue to flare up. If you go on Google, if you go on, any search site and search the record of Jon Jones and the things that he has done in his life, it becomes a gray area from a mistake to a decision. A mistake is, oh man, I wasn't thinking, I did this, I did that. That's a mistake. A decision is when you decide to go down the road that Jon Jones has with steroids, growth hormone, bending the system, breaking the rules, hit and run, DWI, firing off a firearm in the dead of night. I mean, these are, if anything, let's take the athletics out of it. These are very concerning instances with Jon Jones, where I've worried for Jon Jones in terms of the man and his actual life. This goes beyond his fighting career. This is only in focus of him as a man. Jon, you have a wife. Jon, you have kids. You can't keep doing this. And I hope that nobody understands that better than Jon Jones. And I'm not going to make this a Jon Jones roast. And if I have, it's tough to apologize for that because I'm not trying to kick a man while he's down. I hate to do that. But I find it completely disrespectful to myself as not just a fan, but somebody that really loves this sport, really appreciates what these athletes have done to create this phenomenon that is mixed martial arts, to convince myself that Jon Jones is the GOAT. I can't do that. I can't do that. What I can do is provide you with what the GOAT term should actually mean. What the GOAT term should actually mean is greatest of all time, accomplishments, check. How he represented the sport, check. How he represented himself, check. How he transcended the game, changed the game. What did he do? How did he do it? So let me throw out to you my MMA GOAT, and it's widely known that I've always said the greatest fighter to ever live in mixed martial arts is not just the greatest fighter in mixed martial arts. He is probably the greatest fighter, period. Because if you put a fighter against another fighter, boxer against an MMA fighter, if you put George St Pierre up against, let's just say, one of the 170-plus pound boxers, one of the best in the world, I guess you could say Bernard Hopkins or young Roy Jones Jr., I don't know. He's one of the best in the world, one of the best 170-pounders in the history of boxing, whoever it may be. Whoever it may be. George St Pierre would have a massive, massive advantage over that fighter. Not in a boxing match, but just in a fight. Because MMA is fighting. Boxing is boxing. Hit and not get hit. The sweet science. MMA is a fight. You're using every limb to try to take out your opponent. And that's why I think it has somewhat surpassed boxing in that fact, but I'll talk about that on another day, not to get off track here. Did George accomplish everything he set out to do? Yes. He had 2 career losses. Jon Jones has never lost. He's lost by disqualification. He's got a no contest on his record due to a failed drug test against Daniel Cormier in the rematch. But has he actually ever been knocked out? No. Has he ever actually been submitted? No. But George has been knocked out. George has been submitted, but George avenged those losses. One time he avenged his loss against Matt Hughes 2 times over. And the second time he rematched Matt Serra after one of the most shocking upsets, I think still to this day, the most shocking upset in the history of MMA. To the next fight, Serra versus GSP2, it was one of the most dominant performances in a world title fight. Matt Serra, God bless him, didn't even look like he belonged in there with him. And he would even admit that. Pretty sure he actually has. So, goes on this welterweight title run, taking on challenger after challenger after challenger, anyone that the UFC put in front of him. They brought guys from other organizations to try to take this guy out. They brought in other fighters from other organizations, maybe not just to take this guy out, but to attack what was perceived at the time as his weaknesses. Well, he just beat Matt Serra. We're going to put him in there against John Fitch, who is undefeated, who is an All-American, high caliber wrestler, and we'll see how he handles that. he dominates John Fitch in the wrestling department to a 50-45 judges scorecard. And not just 50-45, I was actually wrong on that. 50-43, 50-44, and 50-44. Dominating the rounds. Then you go to the next fight against BJ Penn, who was the UFC lightweight champion at the time. This was the first ever champ versus champ fight in UFC history. UFC 94, GSP and BJ Penn fought once before. It was a war. It was a battle. And GSP made BJ Penn quit on his stool that night in the 4th round, defending the UFC welterweight championship. And post that fight, I think that was the beginning of the end for BJ Penn. UFC 100, one of the greatest pay-per-view events ever. George St Pierre takes on a very, very athletic, powerful striker in Thiago Alves and defends the title. They then put him up against this brash Brit as the UFC was trying to dip more into the UK market by bringing him a knockout artist in Dan Hardy, who had knocked out Mike Swick in a title eliminator performance, and Mike Swick was knocking everybody out at one point in his UFC MMA career. Now, this is where I go back to my point about casual fans versus hardcore fans. You can't say who the GOAT is when you've only watched the sport for 2-3 years. It's do your research. Read up. Do your studying. Make it happen. George fought Dan Hardy tooth and nail, and Dan Hardy was one of the toughest SOBs I've ever seen challenged for a title, because there were many moments where that fight should have been stopped, many moments where George had Dan Hardy's arm twisted like a pretzel. I mean, it was crazy. Then they start to dabble in other fighters from other organizations. Jake Shields, brought on from Strikeforce. And he was billed as this guy that, man, he's so tough, he's so nasty. He's defending the Elite XC Welterweight Championship. He won the Strikeforce Middleweight title. He defended the Strikeforce Middleweight title. Then he went to the UFC. He didn't just defend the Strikeforce Middleweight title. He beat Dan Henderson to defend the Middleweight title. And George made this guy look like an average Joe and beat him at his own game in 5 rounds. Many people wondered, how would George take on a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu ace, a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt in Jake Shields? How would he work in his guard? If George is this takedown tactician, this extremely offensive wrestler, how is that going to look, George on top of Jake Shields? Can Jake Shields pull off the submission? He's done it before. Not that night. And that night I remember very well. It was my 19th birthday, April 30th, 2011. Then George suffers a devastating ACL tear. They have to put up a belt. They have to put up some sort of belt to keep the division going. UFC puts up the interim welterweight title belt. And Carlos Condit and Nick Diaz, who the UFC originally scheduled to fight GSP, but that fight fell out because Nick didn't show up for the press conference. George then signs the bottom line to fight the natural-born killer. This guy was literally nicknamed the natural-born killer, Carlos Condit of WEC fame. And Condit then takes on Nick Diaz, beats him, then fights George. George coming off of an ACL tear. He goes through Carlos Condit like a hot knife through butter. And Carlos Condit at the time had the highest finishing rate in MMA welterweight history. The highest finishing rate. Then you get the Nick Diaz fight. The fight that everybody thought would be a problem for George. How is George going to react to the trash-talking of Nick Diaz? How is George going to work with the great boxing that Nick Diaz has? How is he going to handle that? The pressure, the style that the Diaz brothers impose on their opponents, much like the casuals eventually saw with Nate Diaz versus Conor McGregor in both fights. The pressure boxing of both Diaz brothers is unlike anything. How is George going to react to that? Well, George took Nick Diaz down 11 times, pounded him, and beat him in 5 rounds. The Johny Hendricks fight is the next fight on George's record, and this was a fight that was very controversial. Most people believe that Hendricks won that fight. It was a split decision. It was a fight that was a bad matchup for George. Here you had a short, stout fighter, much like Serra, but not only did he have power like Serra, but he had a all-American wrestling background. Johny Hendricks is one of the greatest NCAA wrestlers to ever live. And that is based on his accomplishments and how he represented NCAA wrestling. And George had a tough go of it the first couple rounds. First 2 rounds were really tough. 3rd round, things got closer. 4th round, 5th round, George definitely won that 5th and final championship round. And the 3 people that mattered, the judges, gave it to George St Pierre via split decision. George decides at that point that the pressure of the business is way too much. That he's defended his title, remained a champion for 6-7 years. 6-7 years. We never see that in MMA anymore. We never see that in MMA anymore, ever. For 6-7 years, George was the welterweight king. Longest reigning UFC welterweight champion ever. I went through the list of his contenders. They were not slouches. They were not scrubs. They were not bums. They were trained killers. And George went through all of them like a hot knife through butter, with the exception of Johny Hendricks. But I will throw this out there. The sport was held by a rubber band at that point in terms of its drug testing. The drug testing was as strong as a tiny, tiny rubber band. Not that strong. Could snap it really easily. And I would say it was a weak rubber band. We'll just say that. Johny Hendricks had the fight of his life that night, and after that, he went on one of the worst UFC fighter runs of all time, losing 6 of 8, 7 of 8, something crazy like that. My memory doesn't serve me right on that, but something crazy. He finished his career like 18-8, 18-9, I believe it was 18-8. At the time he fought George St Pierre, he only had 1 career loss or 2 career losses. So he really went down a tailspin after that. And it really makes you wonder. It really makes you wonder. That I have to say. And then George does something that I honestly wondered if he would ever do it. I had a lot of reasons to believe that he wouldn't, but he did. He came back. Came back to the sport after 4 years off and did something that would test the opinions of the average Joes that debated against him. The average Joes would say, he never fought at middleweight, never fought in 2 weight classes, didn't fight Anderson Silva. Well, he fought a guy that beat Anderson Silva in Michael Bisping and choked him unconscious to win the UFC middleweight title. People can say whatever they want about who the MMA GOAT is. They're entitled to their opinion. But there will never be a better representation of the sport of mixed martial arts in terms of what it means to be a martial artist than George St Pierre. Never. There might be fighters that come along that represent the sport great, do great things. In fact, we got a few of them right now that are doing some great things. Henry Cejudo was another one that I'm going to dive into later today, but Henry Cejudo was one of them. And, I think there will be more along the way for sure. It's just what happens in MMA. But nobody represented the sport of MMA better. You had kids wearing karate gis in the crowd that George would run up to and shake their hand. You had moms watching pay-per-views because they thought George St Pierre was attractive. I mean, it was hilarious. And I think you wouldn't have the UFC on this global level without George St Pierre in terms of what he did to bring the sport to Canada at the Rogers Center for the Jake Shields fight, 55,000 strong. Jon Jones hasn't done any of that. Who is really going to remember a Jon Jones fight outside of the ones where Jon Jones was challenged? I don't think, I'll remember the Shogun Rua fight for sure, but there's always a caveat to any positive thought about Jon Jones, which baffles me that UFC President Dana White would even entertain the thought of Jon Jones being the GOAT. I wouldn't put Anderson Silva over Jon Jones for the same reasons that I wouldn't put Jon Jones over Anderson Silva. They're both cheaters. They both broke the rules. George St. Pierre's reputation and record is as clean as a whistle. And I think that helps. Dana White, I'm really scratching my head on this one, big guy. I'm really scratching my head on this one, Uncle Dana. I don't get it. I think Jon Jones has had one of the biggest what-ifs in MMA history. What could have been in MMA history? Not GOAT, not greatest of all time, not the best ever, not TBE. Not even close. I'm Ryan Thomas. That was the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. Jon Jones, not my GOAT. My GOAT is George Rush St. Pierre, former UFC welterweight, former UFC middleweight. And that's another thing. He's on the short list of fighters that won 2 titles in 2 different weight classes. I highly doubt Jon Jones will move up to heavyweight. I highly doubt it. If he wanted to, he would have done it already. Had plenty of opportunities to do so. 1, number 2, reports are that he asked for an insane amount of money. Who knows if that's true or not. But if that's the case, only Jon Jones would ask for more money during a pandemic. Only Dak Prescott and Jon Jones would ask for more money during a pandemic. Give me a break. Give me a break. Ask Daniel Cormier if Jon Jones is the GOAT. That opinion I'm honestly curious to hear. I'm Ryan Thomas. Thank you so much for tuning in. For more episodes of the Thomas Take Sports Podcast, you can find it pretty much everywhere. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. It's everywhere. You'll find it at Ryan Thomas Take for Twitter and Instagram purposes. Thomas Take Sports Podcast on Facebook with the Facebook page. Plenty of live videos for you guys to tune into and enjoy. Stay safe, everybody. These are really trying times, very hard times, but we'll get through it together. We always have, we always will. Take care.